The hue versus hue curve is your best tool for making your colors pop and look like what you see on the big screen. So in this episode of Pro Colorist Explains, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about the hue versus hue curve, and then I'm going to show you the simple, subtle, but powerful ways that pro colorists apply that knowledge so that you feel like you know exactly what you're doing with this tool the next time you're using it inside of Resolve. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at the hue versus hue curve. So first things first, what is the hue versus hue curve? What are we looking at here? What is this tool designed to do? This one, for whatever reason, really confused me when I was first learning it. I found it more confusing than, say, hue versus sat or some of the other HSL curves because it's the same term repeated. Hue versus hue, what exactly does that mean? How does that work? Well, it's actually really simple. If we take a look at the graph here, we have two axes, right? We have a horizontal or an x-axis, and we have a vertical or a y-axis. Because we are plotting hue versus hue, both of these axes represent hue. You guessed it, right? So if we look left to right here, we're starting red, going through yellow, green, all the way back through cyan, magenta, and then all the way back into red. So this is the first thing to note about this tool that's going to make it a lot less confusing. Hue, unlike other image attributes, things like luminance or saturation, hue runs in a circle, doesn't it? That's why our vector scope is a circle here, right? So what's happening when I hit the right edge of my hue versus hue curve? I'm actually going to loop right back around to this left edge. And we can even see this if we grab for our preset down here in the lower left, which lets us select our different primary or secondary presets here. If I grab for the red, I've got this rather confusing plot because my goalposts are on either side of red, which is here at 0. The right edge is here and the left edge is actually over here because of this sort of looping behavior of a hue channel, all right? So that's one of the first things we want to understand there. But at any rate, that is the horizontal axis, the x-axis of this graph. Okay, what about the vertical axis? Also hue. So if we create our red preset, or a bit less confusingly, let's do our yellow preset. And now you can see left edge of my goalpost, right edge of my goalpost. And in between, I've got this one control point where I can rotate stuff, right? So I can rotate my yellows toward red or bring them down toward green. And the same idea is going to be true for any of the other presets or any other shapes that I might draw with hue versus hue. Hue versus hue is here to allow us to rotate hue within a specific range of hues. That's why it's called hue versus hue. Now, by the way, if we wanted to use this tool in a kind of naive, like ultra simple way, you could actually just create a single control point and drag up or down. What am I getting when I do this? This is actually identical to working my hue knob here in my primaries. Same exact thing. So the hue versus hue curve is giving us the ability to make a hue rotation that we might make here in our primaries, but confined to the hue that we have chosen, to the hue that we have defined with our goalpost, with that left and right edge that we just saw with our yellow preset, all right? So that's the bare bones foundational concept that drives hue versus hue. And I love this tool because in presenting these rotations to us in the form of curves, this tool is going to bias us towards making sensible, gentle, easy adjustments to our image, as opposed to more tight, artifact-prone adjustments like we are often going to find ourselves making with something like a qualifier. So it's one of the reasons I really, really like this tool. If we do something dumb, it will look dumb not only in our image, but it will look dumb in the curve graph because we're doing things too tightly and the curve itself feels kind of chunky and ugly, right? So let's dive in and talk about some practical applications, some practical ways that I like to use this tool. And along the way, we're going to end up getting a really good tour of all of the different options and features available within the tool. Let's take a look at shot number 2 here. So with shot number 2, as you can see, I've already done some grading. I'm going to turn everything off, turn it back on. I've gone ahead and set my primaries over here, my exposure, my contrast. And over here in my balance node, I've also balanced things out. Now, this is an example of a kind of tricky shot to balance. It's one of these shots where the light source that was actually used to illuminate this scene is not the light source that the camera was expecting. This is whatever kind of funky fluorescent lighting happens to be on this train, right? So getting the balance, just feeling kind of like neutral and balanced, can take a minute. This is not always the easiest balance to find. And once you do, the last thing you want to do is go shifting it around again, right? I've got a foundation here that I feel pretty good about. Might have taken me a little bit longer than my average balancing job. So the last thing I want to do is go moving it around, even though there might be more I'd like to do with the colors in this image. This is a great use case for the hue versus hue tool. So I'm going to go down here to the lower branch of my parallel node structure here. I'm just going to grab node number 5, and I am interested in refining the exact hue of my yellows in this image. I just think that I could get a more pleasing, more kind of harmonized yellow color in this frame. So what I'm going to do, I've got two options. I could grab my yellow preset for one. That's going to give me these goalposts and my yellow here. And I can now drag this up or down, and you can see I'm rotating my hues within the bounds of these goalposts, which is generally going to be yellow. Now, here's a great rule of thumb, great thing to keep in mind with hue versus hue. When you're using these presets, which can work great, it's going to tend to be too broad. You're going to tend to need to choke these goalposts in so that you're not having unwanted influence on hues that are adjacent to your hue of interest, in this case, yellow. So what does that look like? If I grab this left control point, I would kind of bring it into the right. And if I drag this right control point, I would bring it into the left, something like that. Something else really helpful to know whenever you are finessing your goalposts, your area of interest for your hue rotation, if I look at my fields down here for input hue and hue rotate, input hue is allowing me to determine where that goalpost sits horizontally. Hue rotate is telling me what I'm doing at that control point. And because these are goalposts, I do not want to rotate hue at these goalposts. I want things to return smoothly to 0. But it's really easy when you're freehanding this in the curve graph to nudge it ever so slightly. You can see I ended up bumping it about 1/2 degree in the process of pulling it to the left. So what I want to do here is just double click inside of this field and explicitly type 0 and say, nope, by this point you should be back to doing nothing at all. If I don't do that, what I'm basically doing is a subtle version of this, where I'm rotating all these other hues as well. That's not what I'm trying to do. The whole purpose of the hue versus hue tool is allow me to make focused hue rotations just within my area of interest, my hue area of interest, okay? So I've got that zeroed out here. Same thing here on the left. I have probably bumped this a little bit. Indeed, I have. So I'm going to set that to 0. And we're now can be confident that we're making a rotation only within this range. And you can see this tool can be very, very fine-tuned, and like you can make very big adjustments without big numerical values here. In this case, I feel like I don't even need half of what I'm looking at right now in terms of what I was kind of hoping to see in the yellow accents here in the frame. So I'm going to drop this hue rotate. I could expand things out and go to my big curves, give myself a better chance of fine-tuning this adjustment, or I can go over here and just drag this around. I think all I really need here is like 3, maybe 4 degrees of rotation to give me a subtle but significant adjustment to my yellows. See what I mean there? Now, to complete my thought that I started a moment ago, we have gotten this set of goalposts by picking out our yellow preset and really just refining that. That's option number 1. That's really good. We're often going to need to start wide and then narrow down when we're going that way. But the other way that I could have done this is by using my eyedropper on the colors in the frame that I want to affect. So if I drag this around here and then I release, you're going to see I'm going to get a set of goalposts in a similar area of the hue wheel. However, these ones have the opposite problem of the presets. These ones are going to tend to be too narrow. So if you're not quite sure where among your red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, or yellow presets you need to grab to affect a certain color in your frame, you can always just eyedropper, but know that when you do, unlike when you grab your presets and you need to narrow, when you grab an eyedropper portion of the frame, you're probably going to need to widen out a little bit. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab this left edge, bring it over here to the left. Good rule of thumb is you actually want these things to be as wide as possible without allowing undue influence, unwanted influence on neighboring hues that you actually don't want to affect. So something like that's probably going to be pretty good. Same rules apply in terms of making sure that you zero out your hue rotation, like so. And I'm now going to grab this middle control point, and I can do something similar. We're just going to rotate it clockwise by a couple degrees. That's all I really need. So this to me is a great example of the type of subtle but significant adjustments you can make to your image with hue versus hue without feeling like you have to start reevaluating your balance. That's what's key for me is I'm like, I spent whatever, 30 seconds, 40 seconds kind of getting this into a happy place. I don't want to have to revisit it just to make a small gain in the way that the overall color palette is being rendered. I'd like to get that upgrade to my color palette, but not if it's going to cost me my foundational balance that I've already established. That's one of the things the hue versus hue tool is great at, because it allows you to refine color on top of a foundation of balance that isn't going to move. You'll notice like my neutrals in this frame, they're not moving at all. The only thing that's moving are my yellow hues. Okay, let's take a look at another example of the way that I love to use the hue versus hue curves. Here in shot number 3, I'm just going to reset this node label here. And I'm once again going to make some rotations down here in node number 5 in the lower branch of my parallel node structure here. But let's talk about what I'm seeing and what I feel like I can use the hue versus hue tool here. What's going on here is something that often comes up in color grading, which is that I have some different colors in this frame. Like I've got the kind of pine straw, like more yellowy color or brownish color of the forest floor. And then I've got the more verdant, more green color of the foliage that's actually on the tree, right? But if I look at this image, it's not very strongly separated. Like I'm not seeing a ton of pop in between those two colors. And you can also see in the vector scope, like, all right, I've got one color that's kind of pointing this way, one color that's pointing that way, but there's not like a world of difference or separation between them in the vector scope or in the image. This is a great use case for the hue versus hue tool as well. Here's what I want to do. I want to rotate my greens of my foliage and see if I can't gently peel these away from the more brownish color of the forest and the forest floor in a way that's going to get me a little more pop in my image. So again, different ways I could go about this. I could try to grab my preset down below here. In this case, I think I'm going to have better luck by simply eyedroppering here inside of the image and looking at the goalposts that I'm given. Now, this is a great example of something that happens from time to time in the hue versus hue tool. You may need to eyedropper more than once. You may need to eyedropper more than once to get the range that you're looking for. This range actually looks pretty decent to me. It just feels like it's going to be a hair wide. So I can either narrow my goalposts by hand, or I can undo this and try again, right? And you might have to try it a few times before you're getting really just the area that you are interested in and getting the width of area that you're interested in. So I'm kind of striking out right now. That seems to be the best that I can do. So let's leave that there, and I'm just going to preemptively choke in my ranges here because I know it's this area that I want to do my rotation in. It's just a question of how much fall off and how much I want to allow that to affect the colors around it before things taper back to zero effect. So let's try something like this. Once again, I'm going to keep an eye on the hue rotate on these goalposts, make sure I've got that zeroed back out. And let's check out what happens if I take this middle control point and start pulling things down. You see what's happening there? Off, on, off, on. I'm creating more separation, more color contrast between the brown of the forest floor and the green of the trees. And in this case, I'm making a big rotation. That's like 30 degrees, where before in shot number 2, we were rotating like 2 degrees. So depending on what you're trying to do and on the shot that you're working with, you can make little or big adjustments. In my case here, I think this is looking decent. I think it's looking a little strong, so I actually want to back it off. I'm going to take this hue rotate and just start to pull it in here and really just finesse how much of that separation I feel like I need. And I feel like even at around a 20 or so, that's a huge gain. That's really helping me to finesse this image and get a better result than I had a moment ago. Now, here's some diligence that I always like to observe when I'm using this tool. I've got what I wanted, right? It's looking pretty decent. What I'm now going to do, if my time permits, I'm just going to see if I can widen this out at all. Because if I can widen it out, it makes it that much more likely that it's going to be smooth, undetectable, not cause any artifacts or problems. And as long as I'm not getting unwanted influence on neighboring areas, then there's no downside to widening this out. It's just going to help me get a cleaner image. You can see as I drag this left control point, there's a point where it's starting to sweep up all of those reds and browns and colors that are a little further left. So I've gone too far there. So instead, I'm just going to look at maybe opening it ever so slightly. And actually, to be honest, as I auditioned that, I feel like we were in a pretty good spot right here in terms of separating the brown things from the more yellowish green things that I want to turn and rotate toward a more pure green. Okay, so another great example of things that we can do with the hue versus hue to kind of articulate and separate our colors from one another and get more separation visually. And you can even see it in the vector scope. Now, again, I've got stuff pointing toward dead green and stuff pointing toward kind of an orangish yellow or the skin tone line almost. So another great use case. Okay, let's take a look at shot number 4 here. We're going to do something different yet again here. In this shot, I just feel like I want to take the opportunity to refine this color palette. This is a beautiful color palette. I really like all the different colors that I'm seeing here, but as I'm looking at them, as I'm looking at the vector scope, I have ideas that I want to explore. I don't even necessarily have an explicit prescription like this must happen to my reds, this must happen to my greens, and so on. I just have ideas that I'd like to explore, and I can explore those ideas cleanly and quickly, whether I'm on my own or even when I'm with a client in the room, because of the way this tool works. So let me show you what I mean. Let's start with these red flowers here. When I look at them and I look at where they are in the vector scope, they're actually rotated like past red. They're starting to swing toward magenta, and I'm interested in seeing what would happen if I eyedropper these and pull them back. Let's get them going straight toward red, like so. Now, this is just an idea. It's just something to audition, and its merit is going to be in my assessment. So do I like it or not? Before? After? I like it. I think it's nice. I really like how it's getting deeper and richer and giving me that more kind of pure red. I do think I went a little bit far. I'm going to try to get the signal mass pointing kind of dead at the red target here in my vector scope, but I think that's a win. I think that's nice. Next thing I want to do here, I want to take a look at this character's garment, this hood over her, and just see if there's something I can do to make it feel better, to sweeten it. I think it looks great now, but I'm just curious to see what happens if I rotate it one way or the other. So I'm once again going to eyedrop her. In this case, I'm going to adjust my goalpost so that I'm kind of centering my operation on this big tooth in the histogram. Just to take a quick minute to contextualize what we're seeing in this histogram, this is a histogram plot of the hues of the incoming image at these various hue points in the color wheel. So you can see in this image, I've got very little that is a pure green. I've got some stuff that's yellowy green. I've got some stuff that's reddish over here. I've got a big strong tooth right here, which is representing this hood. And then I've got a decent sized hump here that is representing these flowers. So it's kind of like a X-ray for the image that tells us where there's strong color to begin with that we might be able to grab and move around. So because I'm seeing that tooth here, I'm like, let's go ahead and just park our control point right on top of that, set sensible goalposts left and right, and once again, just make sure that the hue rotation of those goalposts is zeroed out so that I'm not unwittingly rotating things outside of the range that I'm trying to manipulate. And all I'm going to do here is just move this around, just see if I can't make it look better than what I was seeing before. I could go a little bit more kind of cyan-y teal by going this way. I think that's kind of nice. I could also make it go maybe a little bit more indigo, like so. That could be really nice too. I'm going to say let's go with that. And if we now go off and then on, we can start to see what's happening here. We've rotated our reds, we've rotated our blues, and these finesses are starting to feel really nice to me. Next thing I want to look at, let's look at these flowers. So I'm going to zoom out here a little bit. I want to do something similar to what we did over here in shot number 2, where I just feel like those yellows might feel really nice if we warmed them up just a pinch. By the way, that's something that we often kind of subconsciously associate with film looks because film tends to render yellow a bit warmer than it actually was captured or than it actually was when the scene was being captured. So it can be a sort of like subconscious way of cueing a filmic aesthetic. It's also just something that I personally think looks nice. So that's often something I will audition when I'm working my hue versus hue is say like, hey, what if we took these yellows and just warmed them a little bit? So I'm going to eyedropper that area and I'm just going to push this up like so. Similar to what we saw in shot number 2, a little goes a long way, like 2-3 degrees, probably all we need, but that's looking really nice, right? So here's where we are at the moment. Before, after. Can you see how we're really starting to reshape this color palette and refine this color palette and really help to art direct the image and finesse the way each of these colors is going to appear in its final rendering. There's one more thing that I really want to do here that is kind of similar to what we did in shot number 3. I want to see what I can do for these greens. So let's eyedropper the greens like so. And in this case, I've been given a nice broad area, which I think is going to work out fine. And what I'm going to do is grab my control point here and pull it down. As we did in shot number 3, this is something that I often like to do. It's kind of a go-to move for me with hue versus hue. I often like to move yellows a little warmer, and I like to move greens a little bit cooler, move them toward like a pure green, or even just a little bit past pure green, starting to approach like cyanish teal, just because that's one way of starting to create more separation between our yellows and our greens, which can often kind of run together and have very low separation. So if we look at the net of what we've done here, especially if we just look at yellow and green here, before, after, that feels more saturated. Even though I haven't touched a saturation knob, I've really just adjusted my rotation for each of these hues. So if we zoom back out now and look at the net of this, this is a great sort of like final example of all the different things that you can do and allow to work together in the hue versus hue curve to allow you to reshape your image, to think about your image in a deeper way, and to sculpt the image into the color palette that's going to work best for you and for your creative intent, or for the creative intent of your client. And you can do it in a very quick, very efficient, very clean way that's also very visual right here within this palette. So that's a good tour of some of the things that I find myself doing most often with the hue versus hue curves. And just to round out the conversation, let's take a look at a few more things we haven't had the chance to discuss yet. Number one, I'm just going to pull this hue rotation back ever so slightly. I think that's a little bit better. But number one, what I want to say is if we look at our editable splines button here, whatever control point I'm selecting right now, if I hit this button, I've now got an editable spline that can allow me to even further finesse this control point. That's a great extra degree of control for when you need it. It's not something I find I often need. So I would encourage leaving this off unless you need it, because if you don't need it, it's just more time that you have to spend fiddling with the curve that isn't necessary. But of course, for situations where you're doing something trickier or more nuanced, it's a great thing to have at your disposal. So that's what's going on there. We've talked about our presets for each of our 3 primaries and secondaries that allow us to drop those kind of predetermined goalposts that we'll often need to choke in. We've seen our input hue and our hue rotate. So whatever control point I've got selected, I am seeing the input hue for that control point, in this case 127 degrees, and I'm seeing how much rotation is happening at that control point, also expressed in degrees. At this control point, it's 0 because this is a goalpost control point. At this control point, it is negative 27 degrees because I'm pulling my yellowish greens and bringing them back down toward a pure green. We took a look at our big curves so that if you're trying to get a little bit more finesse or nuance or control over the shapes that you're drawing, you might want to pop these out like so. And the last thing I want to point out is the histogram option here in our ellipsis menu. So we've already looked at our histogram and at the histogram underlay we're seeing as we work our hue versus hue curves. I love having this histogram underlay because it tells me where there's color to be exploited, to be manipulated. If you're in an area like this and you're trying to affect a big change in the image, you are not going to have much luck because the histogram plot is telling me there's not much image there. The taller the plot is, the more image is living in that area of the hue wheel. The lower it is or the more absent it is, the less image there is. So this is a really good predictor that if I try to do something here, I'm not going to see much change, and any change I do see is likely to have problems or artifacts associated because there's just not enough color in the image for the tool to bite into, okay? So I always work with this histogram set to on, or set to input rather. The other option that we have here is to set the histogram to output. This means that these plots will move as we adjust. So instead of plotting the hue distribution of the image as it came into this node, the output option is plotting the hue distribution after we have made our adjustments. Now, for me, I find that confusing. I want to see where my incoming hues are and then manipulate things by targeting them. You can see if I flip this to output, these now all move based on what I've done. I find that confusing. I feel a little bit like it's chasing my own tail. I like to leave the histogram set to input, but you should certainly feel free to experiment with both options and see which works best for you. So there you go. That's your overview of the Hue versus Hue tool. Love the Hue versus Hue tool. There's tons of power within it. There's the ability to really quickly, cleanly, intuitively affect subtle but big changes in your image. And I hope that this walkthrough gives you a much stronger sense of ownership of the tool and the ability to work through it with confidence the next time you need to refine your color palette when you're grading.